visited the US as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest economy. In modern India, women are leading us to a better future. India grows while being responsible about our planet. We became the only G20 country to meet its Paris commitment. We protected our people with 2.2 billion doses of made in India COVID vaccines, and that too free cost. लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारे रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं। लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है।
So there was a lot of chatter around democracy and Mr. Modi's government's track record when it comes to minority rights and religious freedoms, etc. But that is just one very small divergence, if I may even use that word, in this relationship. More than 99% of this relationship between India and the United States is being defined by convergence. So I spoke to a very special guest. Admiral John Kirby is the communications in charge for the National Security Council, one of the top members of Joe Biden's national security team. And I asked him, what is the big takeaway from this visit? Yes, people are talking about technology transfer in defense. People are talking about, easing up the visa processes for Indians and Americans. But what is the one big defining sort of takeaway of this visit? This is Admiral John Kirby speaking exclusively to CNN News 18. All right, so it's been what many are describing a watershed visit by Prime Minister Modi to the White House. I have with me the coordinator for strategic communication of the National Security Council, Admiral John Kirby. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Great to be with you.
The headline seems to be the jet engine deal between GE and HAL. Could you throw some more light on, how many numbers of engines are we talking about, and how long do you see the congressional process, the approvals for this to go through?
Well, we're going to work with Congress to push this through and to completion as soon as possible. I couldn't give you an exact time frame. And as for the numbers, I think that's really going to be up to the two companies to speak to. But let's not lose the forest for the trees here. I mean, this is a significant, as you said, a significant deliverable by General Electric and by both of our countries to allow for co-production of these jet engines, which are the best in the world and will have an enormous impact, not just on capabilities inside India, military and civilian aviation, but also, as Prime Minister Modi said, creating jobs for both of our countries. So a really key moment. We're really proud that this came together for the state visit. But it wasn't just the jet engines either.
Yeah.
It was cooperation on space and the Artemis Accords. It was improving people-to-people ties. India is now going to buy more than 30 MQ-9 drones, which will help their military capabilities using those American drones. I could go on and on. There was just so much that these two leaders agreed to.
So just on the defense partnership itself, the buying of the drones, now the jet engines, would you now characterize this more less as a transactional buyer-seller relationship and more of a knowledge partnership or a technology partnership?
Absolutely. I mean, the relationship with India really cross-cuts all sectors, public and private, whether it's economy, science, engineering, emerging tech. One of the things that the two leaders talked about was building more resilient supply chains for semiconductors. And India's investing more in American semiconductors. We're investing more in some clean energy technology that India's working on. So, I mean, there's just an awful lot of cross-pollination here in trade and tech that I just think augurs really, really well for this partnership going forward.
Could you give us some more specifics on the semiconductor part? We've heard about the Micron deal, but is there anything more specific you can share on what the nature of this cooperation is?
Well, I think we're still going to work out some of the details going forward, but remember what happened during the pandemic, and that was where we all of us, India included, really saw the fragility of the supply chain process. And what we're trying to do here with India is make that supply chain much more resilient to those kinds of shocks. And that means we've got, India has such a bright and viable high-tech industry, and we want to be able to tap into that innovation and that thinking, so that both of our supply chains, should there be another pandemic, should there be another shock to the international system, doesn't fall victim.
So, last couple of questions. One on the H-1B, and one of the concerns, this is one of the pain points for Indian Americans, techies who are living and working here, that they had to leave the country to renew their H-1Bs and come back to get the stamp. I believe that's being relooked at. Could you give us some details?
I don't have an update for you on that. That's really a better question for the State Department.
All right. Final word. There was a question that was asked today to the Prime Minister and to the President about concerns regarding India's human rights record, its religious freedom record, and so on. Do you have any concerns about India's record when it comes to treatment of religious minorities, press freedom, etc.?
I think President Biden addressed this during the press conference, and he talked about the fact that, one of the things that close friends and partners can do is have these kinds of candid discussions. And as the president said, they did have that kind of a discussion today. Human rights are a cornerstone of President Biden's foreign policy, and we never shy away from expressing those concerns to any foreign leader that we're talking about. But when you have mutual respect, when you value each other and each other's democratic systems, you can have those kinds of conversations, and you can work together to see, what can be done to continue to advance the very vibrant democracy that India has. I mean, it didn't get a lot of headlines, but one of the most important outcomes of this bilateral discussion today was improving people-to-people ties. And when you have two democracies, the most populous and the oldest, with a young population in each country that really want to innovate, they really want to advance, they really want to prosper, focusing on the democratic institutions that underpin that, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all of that makes that innovation so much better. So it's really to both of our advantages that we can have those kinds of discussions.
So that was Admiral John Kirby from the National Security Council here at the White House, giving us his assessment of what to make of this visit and what are the takeaways of this visit. I also now want to go across to a very special guest who is joining us, university professor at the Columbia University, and somebody who's been very closely tracking the Indo-US partnership for the last many decades, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on this special edition of Brass Tacks, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. The trajectory of the Indo-US bilateral relationship over the last 20 years, I think one watershed, of course, was 2005-06, when the Indo-US civil nuclear deal was signed. And then you had another big moment when Prime Minister Modi came in 2014 for his first visit to the United States as Prime Minister. And in the last 9 years, the engagement across multiple administrations, whether it was with President Obama, then President Trump, and now with President Biden, Prime Minister Modi seems to have been able to forge some kind of a friendship, some kind of a linkage across these three presidencies, across these three administrations, and with these three individuals as president. How much do you see from whatever you've seen of this visit and what we've seen in the last many visits that the Prime Minister has undertaken over multiple administrations? How much of his personal equation, charisma with these leaders is driving this relationship?
Well, I'm, of course, very glad to see good relations between the United States and India. But I also look to India to help promote good relations across the whole world. India has the presidency of the G20. That brings together really the core of the world economy. And at a time of such stress where U.S.-China relations are very stressed and dangerous. And of course, U.S.-Russia relations don't exist now other than at war. I hope that Prime Minister Modi will use his leadership skills, which are enormous, to promote global cooperation, not only India-U.S. cooperation.
I want to talk a little bit about U.S.-India, particularly on the trade front. And I think the buzz here in Washington is, this is a defining moment. This is an inflection point in the bilateral between Washington and Delhi, because both sides, certainly from the leadership downwards, are giving this message that America is willing to take the same bet, make the same investment in India over the next 10, 20, 30 years, like it did with China in the late 1970s when Deng Xiaoping was the Chinese leader. And you saw the economic transformation of China over the last 30 years. Today, as you said, given where things stand between Washington and Beijing and between Washington and Moscow, is that something that you see as an economic leapfrog moment, both for the U.S. and India? As President Biden said yesterday at the state dinner, America's future is intertwined with India's future, certainly economically speaking. Do you see that sort of leapfrogging in the next decade or so?
Well, of course, there should be good, strong economic relations, but it's obvious the U.S. also wants to use India in the U.S. supposed fight with China. India does not want to be used by anybody. India stands on its own. India should have good relations within the BRICS, meaning with Russia, with China, with South Africa, with Brazil, as well as good relations with the U.S. But the U.S. aims to put India against American opponents. I think, of course, India knows this. Indian leaders know this. India doesn't want to be used and could never be used by the United States for these purposes, but that's the idea of the Quad arrangement and so forth, that somehow India will become a bulwark for U.S.-led geopolitics. This, to my mind, is extremely naive, especially since India is so much larger than the United States in population, of course. It's almost 5 times larger. And because India has interests in good relations with Russia, with China, with other parts of the world. So I just think it's important to understand the U.S. motivation is a little one-sided, and India's motivation, I think, is to have good relations with all parts of the world.
One of the core areas, and we saw one of the big deals that were announced yesterday, was in the field of defense cooperation, not just a transactional one, a buyer-seller one, but transfer of technology, the jet engine deal. Given the complex geopolitical situation, the war in Ukraine, and of course, India's dependence traditionally on Russia for its military supply chains, do you see that changing because of the war, and India will be far less dependent on Russian military parts and supplies, let's say 10 years from now, as compared to 10 years ago? And also, how does the China threat play in all of this? Many are saying the reason why there is this almost intertwined defense relationship between the U.S. and India is because of China. China is the unsaid factor in the room.
Well, I think India needs to be careful about signing up to something it doesn't want to sign up to, which is to be some kind of junior partner in a U.S. military alliance. Because my own view is the U.S. is on the wrong track right now. The U.S. still aims for a kind of global leadership, which I think is naive, because the U.S. should just be one of several centers of global power in a truly multipolar world, India being one of them, China being another, European Union being another, United States being another. I hope the African Union, as an integrated Africa, will become another in the future. India does not want to become part of the U.S. military alliance. Heaven forbid for India. India wants to have its own regional interests and national interests, but especially the interest of a multipolar world. The United States is against a multipolar world. The United States wants U.S. dominance, which, again, is out of date and naive. And India should, of course, be fully aware of the U.S. motivations.
You'd also recently said, Professor Sachs, that the U.S. is unnecessarily hyping up the China threat. And I'm just curious to know of that in the context of India and China, because India's had its own troubles with China since 2020. There was aggression at the northern borders. There was an attempt to unilaterally change the status quo, and India's responded measure for measure. How does India then take on this China threat? Because the argument, the other side to the argument that you've put forth is that India cannot take on China on its own right now, which is why it needs the United States to project power more than its capabilities right now. Maybe its capabilities will increase manifold in the next decades, but right now, for it to be able to stand up to China, it needs the help of the United States. So what would you say to that?
India's strategy should be to negotiate with China, to discuss. India is the only country that can say to China, you're smaller than we are in terms of population. So India is a vast country, a great civilization, an ancient and great global culture. So India should sit down with China and say, look, we have tensions on our northern borders in the Himalayan region. We need to resolve those because we have so much at stake in cooperation. We have so much potential in trade, in technology. We have so much need to work together on issues like climate change that these border tensions need to be put past us. So to my mind, there's no way of doing this other than through negotiation.
All right, Professor Sachs, I'll get a final word from you before we open this up to our panelists. Just on the India story, you have seen the trajectory of India, the economic story of India change over the last 10 years. It's now a $3.5 trillion economy. It's the number 5 biggest economy in the world, overtaking Britain recently. What is the future course as you see it for India? Are you bullish on India as the next big emerging power, possibly the 3rd biggest economy by the end of this decade?
I think India's dynamism is absolutely real. And what's happening is that India is really making excellent use of the digital revolution and of green technologies. So right now, India is massively expanding digital access. It is massively creating digital platforms, which I think will be transformative for healthcare, for education. They already are transformative for payments and finance and government services and licensing. India, I believe, will become one of the world leaders in renewable energy, especially solar power. And thanks goodness for that, because India is also highly vulnerable to the global climate change. India is growing roughly at 7% per year, according to the typical GDP measures. That means a doubling every decade. This is absolutely feasible. In fact, I would say it's rather necessary for India. India could even go farther in a world that is peaceful and growing and avoiding conflict. So I think India has big stakes in the overall peacefulness of the world economy and resisting the very naive talk in the United States about decoupling and so forth. This is not in any way realistic or even safe for the world. So yes, I'm very bullish. I believe that India is in a dramatic phase of upswing. I want to see India's education system really perform with excellence in the coming quarter century. This is where China's strength has been phenomenal. China, within a generation, dramatically lifted the quality of education. And now you see it when you see the rankings of research outputs of major institutions. China is now usually 5 of the top 10 in technology. Now, India, of course, can get in there in its full fair share. But that's a major investment in educational upgrading and expanding the university systems and the technology and research systems. But I'm also very happy that many of India's great companies, Reliance and Tata and others, are making big investments in the new technologies. And this is very important and very gratifying.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, for joining us with your thoughts and perspective on how you see the